Hi, I'm Maribeth Quinn, a mixed media collage artist.
I am going to just make a little 6x6 botanical painting, and I'm going to show you how I use my homemade tissue papers that I have just taken tissue paper and tinted it with acrylic paint. And I'm going to use these papers on top of my acrylic painting. They will be soft, they'll be full of depth and dimension because they get effects that I just haven't been able to get with paint so far. So let's get started on this.
So I'm just taking a piece of 12 by 12 watercolor paper and I'm going to just divide it into 4 sections. So each of them are 6 by 6, and really at this point I want to just work with 2 of them at one time. I kind of now wish I had left them attached so they wouldn't curl so much, but you live and you learn. So here I'm just adding a little bit of blue paint in varying colors. I'll put those in the description, and not being precious about this at all. I just want to get a background with some light and some dark areas on these small pieces of paper. So I'm pulling out my tempera paint sticks and I'm just making some very, very loose marks that will help me sort of be a placeholder for where I'm going to put these botanical figures. It's important to me at this point not to be specific, so I'm just generally adding these colors here.
Something to adhere the paper to the surface, which I use golden satin glazing liquid. It is fantastic for just adhering paper to the surface of the painting, but it's also fantastic for thinning out your paint. So I will, at the end, much of the time, use a light glaze over the painting to take my collage pieces into a whole new area, a dreamier effect. So I always put this, because I buy it in bulk, I put it in a smaller, more sporty jar, easier to handle. I am going to begin with just some light tissue. I have taken this tissue, just a regular piece of tissue paper, and I have painted on some diluted acrylic paint in all sorts of different colors. I have an entire box of different colored paper. I'm constantly making it, all variations of color, and then I have it separated out so I can easily find it. It's wonderful. It gets these fabulous marks on it when it hits up against other paper as it's drying, and there is no end to the color variation that you can make on these papers. That beautiful, beautiful rich color. So I have boxes full of tissue paper, and so now I am going to just take out a few pieces that I am going to use for this project to add depth and dimension to this painting.
So now I'm just going to get started. Now this video is in some places really speeded up, simply because I'm tearing little bits of paper and just placing them all over the painting. But another reason that I've really sped it up is because I really want to emphasize on this layering process. It's not as important about where you put the papers, but that instead that you get many layers of paper with the color variations and maybe the texture variations, because this is what is going to add that depth and dimension. So It's not a one and done thing where you just put on a piece of paper and there it is. You've got this dimension in this flower. Instead, it is many little pieces of paper that when it's put on one flower piece or on a string of flowers, it really gives you that feeling that you get in nature, where flowers are quite imperfect. This is actually one of my favorite things about flowers in the wild, or just flowers in a wild garden, is that they're not perfect. They don't present as these perfect little examples, but instead are lopsided and folding over themselves, and sometimes the petals are stuck together, and the way the light comes through, you see part of the flower and maybe not part of the flower. It's magical. And so when I'm painting botanicals, that's really what I'm reaching for. I'm reaching for the whimsy, the imperfection, and even the temporal sort of characteristics that these flowers have. They may be alive and beautiful for one day and then they're gone. And I love getting that quality to them. So that's really what I'm going for when I'm using all of these different pieces of paper. Now right here you see me with some mulberry paper. Mulberry paper is something that you can buy online. I think it's made from fibers from tree bark. It's very consistent in color, unlike the tissue papers that I do myself. I use predominantly my own homemade tissue papers, but I will use these mulberry papers torn into these tiny pieces and then just stuck on the flower in different places, not in a uniform way, but in a haphazard way, because it really lends itself to that whimsical nature. And also, in contrast to the semi-transparent tissue paper, it has nice qualities, those two playing together. So now I'm adding some darker, richer pieces of tissue paper and then feathering out that dark contrast with some, I don't know, intermediate blues right there to, like I said, just feather it into the surrounding area so it's not quite so harsh and the edges aren't quite so hard, but I do like to see those edges of the paper. So I'm just adding depth to the paint that's already there by using these semi-transparent papers. You can still see some of the paint shining through, and now the papers are just lending to what's happening there on the surface. That paper right there has a lot of, and this one too, a lot of interesting marks on it from the way that they were colored. So I really loved using those. So now I'm just adding centers to some of these flowers just to give them a little anchoring point. And in this corner up here, I'm trying to bring back those flowers so that they appear to fade into the distance. That is one thing I love when the sun is shining and it comes through plants in nature. You can really see some in high contrast to ones that lose themselves in the light. So that's really what I'm going for when I use these tissue papers to cover over some. And then I leave some bolder. So here's a little close-up. I was really happy with how these turned out. And more close-up shots of what's really happening there on the surface. And then the final pieces. I was very happy with how these turned out. And 6x6 is a great place to start. It's not overwhelming. And listen, if you want to join me in learning more about how to paint with paper, this is a great class to start with. Introduction to Collage, Learning to Paint with Paper. Come join me. The link is in the description. And if you're not quite ready to join a class, you can get this free collage kit, also in the description, and I will just introduce the topic to you in a very easy way. Well, I love spending time with you as always, and I love hearing your comments.